The next topic is the cranial nerves. There are 12 pairs of cranial nerves which are part of the peripheral nervous system. Their cell bodies and control centers are located in the brain stem. They then exit through the skull to various organs throughout the body. They innervate the special senses of sight, hearing, and smell, as well as sensation throughout the face and many parts of the body. And they also play an important role in the parasympathetic nervous system, and the vagus nerve innervates the organs of the thoracic and abdominal cavities. One way to remember the names of these 12 cranial nerves is a sentence I'll give you now. On old Olympus, towering top, a friendly Viking grew vines and hops. The first letter of each word in that sentence will give you the first letter of the name of the cranial nerve. The first cranial nerve is the olfactory nerve. It's a purely sensory nerve that helps with the sense of smell. The olfactory cells that are in the upper part of the nose, you can see how that region is in the upper part of the nasal cavity there. They converge and form the olfactory nerve, which goes directly into the temporal lobe where the sensation of smell is perceived. The second cranial nerve is the optic nerve. Again, this is a sensory nerve which carries the information from the retina in the eye to the visual cortex in the brain, and its pathway we'll talk about more when we talk about the special senses, but it's kind of outlined here in your slide. The third cranial nerve is a motor nerve. There's no sensory fibers in it. And it has a branch that goes to the superior rectus muscles of the eyeball, inferior rectus, inferior oblique, and the medial rectus muscles. These four muscles help to control movements of the eyeball. It also has a small branch of the ciliary muscle which controls the lens inside the eye. Fourth cranial nerve, again a motor nerve. This is the smallest of the 12 cranial nerves, and it just has a branch to the superior oblique muscle of the eye. And this helps to turn the eyeball in a downward and inward direction. The fifth cranial nerve, the trigeminal nerve, is the largest of the cranial nerves. It's a mixed nerve, so it has both motor and sensory fibers, and it supplies muscles of the face, and you can kind of see that here. We have three branches, the ophthalmic, the maxillary, and the mandibular branches, and they go to the different regions that their names imply. Ophthalmic to the region around the eye, maxillary, the upper jaw, and mandibular down to the lower jaw. Here you can see another view of the trigeminal nerve showing the trigeminal ganglion, which is a large cell body collection that's part of the control centers for the trigeminal nerve. And here we have the lateral rectus muscle being innervated by the sixth cranial nerve, which is the abducens nerve. This is another motor nerve, and it's originating in the pons in the brain stem. So when it contracts, it pulls the eye laterally. The seventh cranial nerve here is called the facial nerve, and it has a mixed axons with some sensory and some motor pathways in it. The motor pathways innervate most of the muscles of facial expression, and the sensory branch just innervates the taste buds from the anterior two-thirds of the tongue. This is the nerve that is affected by Bell's palsy, a condition where you'll have paralysis of one side of the face. Here we have the eighth cranial nerve, the vestibular cochlear nerve. It originates within the ear. It's a purely sensory nerve, and it carries the signals for hearing and for balance to the appropriate centers in the temporal lobe. We'll talk about it more when we talk about those special senses. The ninth cranial nerve is called the glossopharyngeal nerve. It's a mixed nerve, and the sensory portions innervate the taste buds of the posterior one-third of the tongue, as well as a motor segment that helps with the production of sound. The 10th cranial nerve, the vagus nerve, is a very important part of the parasympathetic nervous system. It innervates the organs of the thoracic and abdominal cavities, bringing parasympathetic signals. Parasympathetic signals to the cardiovascular system tend to, especially the cardiac muscle, tend to slow down the heart rate. On the other hand, as far as the digestive tract is concerned, it tends to stimulate peristalsis. So it has a different effect on different organs in those regions. The 11th cranial nerve is the accessory nerve. It's a motor nerve, and it innervates the sternocleidomastoid and some of the upper trapezius muscles. So it helps to coordinate movement of the head, and the way that we test for this is have someone shrug their shoulders up and you press down and see if they have equal strength on both sides. The 12th and last cranial nerve is the hypoglossal nerve. This is a motor nerve, and it conducts impulses to muscles of the throat, the tongue, and that area where they're involved in speech and swallowing. Quick recap now on all the cranial nerves. The first one is the olfactory. The second is the optic nerve. The third is the ocular motor nerve. Fourth is the trochlear nerve. Fifth is trigeminal nerve. The sixth is the abducens nerve. The seventh is the facial nerve. The eighth is the vestibulocochlear nerve. The ninth is the glossopharyngeal nerve. The 10th is the vagus nerve. The 11th is the accessory nerve. And the 12th, the hypoglossal nerve. The last portion of the nervous system that we have left to discuss is called the autonomic nervous system. It controls the involuntary processes involved in life. There's two branches, the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. Together, they innervate the cardiac muscle and much of the smooth muscle of the digestive tract. They also innervate the glandular tissue of the body, so pretty much all the organs of the thoracic and abdominal cavities are innervated by these two branches of the autonomic nervous system. An important exception are that the smooth muscles that line the cardiovascular system, or the arteries, are not innervated by the parasympathetic nervous system, but only the sympathetic nervous system. And that goes for the skin as well. The skin is innervated by the sympathetic nervous system, but not the parasympathetic nervous system. These systems have control centers in the central nervous system, and then their axons are leaving the brain and the spinal cord at different levels depending on which system is involved. As you can see in the diagram here, the parasympathetic nervous system is involved with cranial and sacral nerves. The cranial nerve that's most important here is the vagus nerve that then innervates many of the abdominal organs, as well as several nerves to the face and the eye. The sacral portion exits through the sacral nerves here and innervates the lower regions of the abdominal cavity and the pelvic cavity. The sympathetic nervous system, on the other hand, has outlet throughout the thoracic and the lumbar spine. And when the axons leave the lumbar spine, they join up with what we call the sympathetic chain ganglion, which you can see here. It's parallel to the spinal column, and there's cell bodies here for the sympathetic nervous system. So the cell bodies here start a new neuron that then goes out from that region to the organs that it's going to innervate. This last slide here shows a comparison between the somatic or voluntary and the autonomic nervous systems, which include the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous systems. Some of the basic differences are that the autonomic or voluntary system uses only one peripheral motor neuron that travels from the central nervous system all the way to the target organ. In the autonomic nervous system, two neurons are utilized. One that's a preganglionic neuron traveling from the central nervous system to a ganglion. A ganglion is a collection of cell bodies somewhere outside of the central nervous system. And then a postganglionic neuron that travels from the ganglion to the target tissue. In the case of the sympathetic nervous system, the preganglionic neuron is quite short and goes to one of the chain ganglia that runs parallel to the thoracic spine. And then it has a long postganglionic neuron that travels out to the effector organs. One specialized function of the sympathetic nervous system involves a preganglionic neuron going to the adrenal gland, and in the medulla of the adrenal gland we have specialized postganglionic neurons which secrete epinephrine directly into the bloodstream. The last example there shows the parasympathetic nervous system, which has a very long preganglionic neuron, travels to a ganglion which is in the wall of the effector organ, and then a very short postganglionic neuron that travels to the actual tissue and causes the effect. The neurotransmitters utilized are often acetylcholine. It's used by the voluntary nervous system and all the preganglionic neurons of both the sympathetic and the postsympathetic nervous system. The postganglionic neurons of the parasympathetic nervous system also use acetylcholine, which usually has an inhibitory effect on their target tissues. The sympathetic nervous system has a unique transmitter that it uses from the postganglionic neuron to the target tissues, and that is epinephrine and norepinephrine. We'll discuss all these details and a lot more in class since there's so much information packed here in this slide.